Welcome to the Oikos Family Podcast. I'm Sonia Wood, and today I'm going to continue with sharing with you from the little audiobook, The Little Medicine Carrier. Today I'm going to share with you Chapter 3. And Chapter 3 is going to have some lessons in it about the danger of harboring envy in our heart, followed on with the importance of being kind. And just, displaying acts of kindness and speaking kindly to one another. And also, at the end of this chapter, there's a word to parents specifically, just some encouragement. And so I think it's best that I actually just keep it this brief so that you can just dive straight into listening to this next chapter. And I do hope you will find it encouraging and you will get some value from it.
Chapter 3. The village of Greychurch lay so close to Northcliffe, where Dr. Bertram lived, that they almost joined. Greychurch consisted of a number of secluded houses, each standing in its own pretty area. There was an ancient church covered with mosses and ivy, and surrounded by fine old elm trees. There was a large pond with luxuriant evergreens planted along its banks. In Greychurch, the fuchsias grew to be almost the size of trees, and myrtle covered the cottages. The place was a favourite spot for invalids to live during the winter. They rented many of the finest houses for that purpose. One day, shortly after George began working for Dr. Bertram, he saw a travelling carriage. It was going up the steep hill which led into Greychurch. A bus filled with servants and a large quantity of luggage followed it. The carriage belonged to a gentleman who had rented Myrtle Dean, one of the largest houses in Greychurch, for the winter. George Wayland had gone to take some medicine to Mrs. Mason, the person in charge of Myrtle Dean. She lived in a small cottage behind the grand house. She was in the housekeeper's room getting everything ready for the family's arrival, when the travelling carriage entered the gates. George had stayed to visit a little with her, because she was one of his mother's oldest friends. The window of the room faced the courtyard, so he could easily see the new arrivals. A fine-looking gentleman with grey hair stepped out of the carriage. He was followed by a very pale-looking young lady, wrapped in velvet and furs. The lady leaned on the arm of the old gentleman, and she seemed to have difficulty walking. After they entered the house, the bus drew up to the door. It extremely amused George to watch the luggage being unloaded. He was pleased the most, however, by a large wicker cage that one of the servants brought from inside of the bus. In it were a pair of doves. A man led a little dog on a leash. A kind-looking old nurse carried another cage, which held the prettiest green bird that George had ever seen. It had a bright red beak and a tuft of golden feathers on the top of its head. George was very fond of all types of animals and birds, and it delighted him to see so many pets. "Oh, Mrs. Mason," he cried, "who owns all those beautiful creatures?" Mrs. Mason was talking to a new servant who had just arrived. The servant heard George's question and answered, "They all belong to Miss Beatrice. She has many more at home, believe me." George sighed. For months he had been saving as much money as he could. He wanted to buy a cage for a young blackbird that a neighbour had promised him. He still had nowhere near enough money. When he saw all these treasures which belonged to just one person, a feeling of envy entered his heart. "She has all those beautiful things," he thought as he walked back to Northcliffe, "and I don't have anything." There was more medicine than usual to deliver that day, and George made several long trips. It was very wet and cold, and his envy and self-pity made the bad weather feel twice as unpleasant. By the time George finished his day's work and trudged home, the usual twinkle had left his eye. A gloomy expression had replaced it. His mother noticed the change, because even though he was tired sometimes, he usually looked cheerful when he got home at night. "Are you sick, George?" she asked. "No, Mother." He must have been sick in his mind, if he wasn't sick in his body. Otherwise, he would never have answered in such a sulky tone. He went and sat by the fire. When his little sister eagerly came to play their regular game, he growled at her. "Can't you leave me alone, Nellie?" he said. "Can't you see I don't feel like playing?" The child drew back with hurt feelings. Mrs. Wayland watched her son with mixed feelings of surprise and sorrow as he sat pouting in the chimney corner. She waited until all the children were in bed before she spoke to him. She scooted her chair across from him in front of the fire and took out her sewing. Usually this was the time when George told his mother all that had happened to him during the day. This evening, however, he sat moody and silent. "Here's a penny to put towards the blackbird cage, George," said his mother. "Mrs. Bertram paid me her wash bill today, and there was a penny left over that she wouldn't take back. I thought you should have it. How much do you have now?" "I only have $1.02, he said. "But thanks for the penny." "So how much does that make altogether?" "That makes $1.51. "Then you're more than halfway there. I'll tell you what. We can save a dime from your paycheck every week when you bring it home. Then you should have your cage before Christmas. Would you like that?" Mrs. Wayland touched George's head as she spoke. "He's tired," she thought. "He's probably been working very hard all day." Her kindness made George come to his senses. He knew very well how important even a dime a week was to his mother. His conscience made him feel guilty for his self-pity. He laid his head on his mother's lap and burst into tears. She didn't scold him. Instead, she asked in a comforting voice, "What's the matter, George? Tell me all about it." The boy told his mother everything. He told her all about Miss Beatrice and her pets, and how, when the envious feeling had begun, he had encouraged it instead of trying to stop it. Happy children are those who have parents who sympathize with them in all their little joys and sorrows. Happy parents are those who have children who confide in them and look upon them as their closest friend on earth. Who else but a parent really has their child's primary interests at heart? Who else is better able to give advice in difficult situations? All people, whether boys or girls, or young men and women, go to your parents with all of your troubles and fears. Don't keep any secrets from them. They have a right to your trust, and they will give you worthwhile advice. Many foolish girls have lived to regret the day when they asked a foolish friend for advice instead of their mother's. Many young men would have been saved from a dangerous path if they had made a friend of their earthly parent whom their heavenly Creator had placed over them. Mrs. Wayland wasn't a scholar, but it is a mistake to think that only scholars can talk well or give good advice. Her heart was in the right place, and she loved her children dearly. She worried about their well-being. Even though she was a very plain-speaking woman, every word she told George went straight to his heart. "Oh, Mother," he said at last, "it was your kindness that did it all. If you had been angry at me like I deserved, my self-pity would have stayed. But instead, your kindness conquered me." Mrs. Wayland remembered the words of a poem that she had read earlier. "Speak gently. It is better far to rule by love than by fear. She thanked God for giving her wisdom to deal gently with her little son. It would be good if all mothers followed Mrs. Whalen's example. Remember the saying, "A soft answer turns away wrath, but harsh words stir up anger." Perhaps the gift of speech is the most abused gift which God ever awarded his creatures. David called his tongue his glory. He said, "I will sing and give praise, even with my glory." Psalm 108 verse 1. How often do our tongues shame us because we use them for the wrong reason? James says, "The tongue can no man tame. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. Therewith bless we God, even the Father, and therewith curse we men, which are made after the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceedeth blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not so to be." James chapter 3, verses 8 through 10. What David and the Apostle James say about the tongue is so different. One calls his tongue his glory, and the other calls it an unruly evil. It will be either one or the other to us. It depends on how we use it. Mothers, if you speak gently to your children, they will love and honor you. Fathers, if you speak gently, your wayward sons will hear and obey even your gentlest advice. Employers, speak gently to your employees, and sisters and brothers, speak gently and kindly to one another. If you are patient with each other's failures, your tongues may be your glory. A quick, unkind word, even though it is regretted as soon as it is said, will cause pain that lasts. Slanderous words that are thoughtlessly spoken cause tremendous harm. We must pray for God's grace, so we will not offend others with our tongues. We must not only pray that the thoughts of our hearts are acceptable, we must also pray that the words which come from our mouths are proper in His sight. That night, George had to go through his mother's room on the way to his own little bedroom. Nellie was lying wide awake, and she watched George as he passed her. He went over to the bed, leaned down and kissed his little sister. "I was mean tonight, Nellie, and I am very sorry. I will play with you tomorrow night." "Thank you, George," she said, and happily nestled her little head into the pillow. George's mother wanted some wood chopped, so he got up very early the next morning. He wanted to do it for her before he left for work. He had worked for more than an hour when his mother came into the yard and saw the heap of wood. George stood there with his cheeks glowing from the exercise and his eyes twinkling with pleasure. Now she knew that his bad attitude had left his heart. In the morning, George rushed to Myrtledene to deliver a package of medicine. "Go as fast as you can, George," said the doctor as he handed him the package. "I want this to get there as soon as possible." It was raining very hard as it had been the day before. George felt strong and happy inside, and he did not slow down. That morning he had prayed and asked God to make him content and grateful for the many blessings he had. He followed the advice his Sunday school teacher had given him once when she was talking about self-pity. She said, "If people were half as quick to count their blessings as they are to pout about their troubles, there would be a lot more thankfulness in the world. Take my advice, George. Whenever you feel like grumbling, start counting all the blessings God has given you. You will find there are many others in the world who are far worse off than you." As he walked along in the wind and rain, Mrs. Oldham's advice came back to him. He thought, "I was very wrong to pout like I did last night. I am healthy and strong, and that's a big blessing. Why, if I didn't have that, I couldn't help my mother. I would be a burden to her like poor Tom Davis is. He is an invalid and has to lie down all the time. If the neighbors didn't pity him and help pay his bills, he would have to go to the workhouse. Then there's my mother. She's such a wonderful blessing. When I saw Jack Brooks the other day, he was wearing old, worn-out shoes and a tattered jacket. He earns as much money as I do, but his mother doesn't care how ragged he is. I know Mother has needed a warm shawl for a very long time. She always gives up things for herself so we can be comfortable. Besides that, I also have a good employer. I certainly do. I would match Dr. Bertram against any other man in Northcliffe. By the time George listed all these blessings, he was more sure that he acted improperly the night before. He decided to try to do much better in the future. On he walked. His funny appearance would have amused anyone walking behind him. A very large umbrella completely hid the little boy, except his boots. He kept on walking, and just before he reached Greychurch, a man on horseback came quickly riding up. "Are you the doctor's delivery boy?" he shouted. "Yes," replied George. "Then hurry with the medicine, because Miss Beatrice has become much worse. I'm going for the doctor now." When George reached Myrtledean, he went straight to the housekeeper's room, because he had a message for Mrs. Mason from his mother. The house seemed to be in a state of uproar. Servants were running back and forth, as if there was something very strange going on in the hallway. "Here, boy, give me the medicine. You sure took a long time. I bet you stopped to play on the way." "No, I didn't," cried George. He turned very red and was about to answer very proudly. He made a successful effort to contain himself, however. In a gentler voice he added, "I came as fast as I could. I didn't waste a minute." The nurse left before George finished speaking. When he got to the door of the housekeeper's room, he ran into the little dog he had seen the day before. It was whimpering sadly. George leaned down and patted the poor animal. It cheered up a little and followed him into the room. "Poor Fido," said Mrs. Mason. "He loves his mistress so much that he can't stand to be without her. The poor lady is so sick today, however, that they had to keep the dog out of her room." "Is she this sick very often?" asked George. "Very often. I am told that she has hardly been well a week since she was born. She suffers terribly, but she is so kind and patient that it is a pleasure to wait on her." George didn't answer. He was busy thinking about what had happened the day before. "I envied Miss Beatrice so much," he thought. "I have been so foolish and wrong.